I tried to leave Vietnam behind me for years, as it was only a place I was and I wanted to withdraw from it. I never thought to think music as an aspect of the Vietnam era.
Welcome, everyone, to the Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Before we get to season 4 of the Scuttlebutt, we wanted to tack on a bonus track for season 3. We received an overwhelming number of responses to our war music episode. We thought that we would read these responses on the podcast and talk about it. The war music episode seemed to touch everybody in a different way. They remembered different music. They were taken back to certain times when they were deployed. And that really got us thinking. So we're getting the band back together, doing the reunion tour, and doing this volume 2 of war music. Moving forward, we would love to do a volume 3 and talk more about World War II era music, Korean War era music, or even post-Vietnam War era music. Easy for me to say. But all of it is fair game. Super excited to read these responses. This is the first response video that we have done, and we want to thank everybody who sent us emails and comments and liked and shared and subscribed due to the war music episode. So joining me again will be Donn Nemchick, Navy, Vietnam era veteran, Ryan All, post 9/11 Army veteran, current reservist, and finally Kevin Koch. I call him a music historian because boy, does he know a lot about it. Super excited to bring you this response video. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please email me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Also, like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you, and if we get more responses, we'll certainly love to bring them up here on the podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. Without further ado, bonus track, War Music Volume 2. Coming at you. We were so overwhelmed with the exciting and interesting responses that we got to our war music episode that we decided we need to do this response episode. We need to read through some of these responses, continue the conversation. Thank you so much for reaching out to us, for reaching out to Donn, and for giving us your thoughts on the war music episode. We really enjoyed it. You'll notice that our music historian, Kevin Koch, is MIA right now. He is with his baby son. So hopefully we'll see him soon. Otherwise, we're going to dive into some of these responses and have some fun with this and talk through sort of what we've heard from you. We always encourage our audience to not only like, share, subscribe, comment, and ring the bell on YouTube, but to reach out to us. Mine is Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for responding to our war music episode. We are going to be heavy into season 4 of the Scuttlebutt. We are in preparation for all new episodes. All the great content you've come to enjoy, maybe some new segments that you haven't heard yet. Those will be upcoming. And also, we're going to be getting back to Ryan Rants, which is something that has been in the works for a while. And we got a really great one coming up this season as well. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into our responses. And the first one that I would like to read is from Brian Schnick. Nice and short and sweet email. He said, "You guys put together a channel of music on YouTube. Super ultra way cool." That's just one, it's a great email. Two, it's just a good reminder for our audience that all the music that we talked about in the War Music Volume 1, we created a channel of that music on YouTube. You can go to that channel. We will list the link here in the chat, and you can go to that, listen to the music that we've been talking about. So I'm going to dive over to Donn here to read the next one. This is from, what'd you say, Lieutenant Commander Doug Thorndike?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for giving me the opportunity today to read some of these comments. Most of them are heartfelt and very sincere, and they're written to me from veterans who I served with or know personally. And the one that stood out very early on was from Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, now retired, Doug Thorndike. He's out in the Seattle, Washington area. We served together back in the day. Very, very intelligent man and a well-read man. So what Lieutenant Commander Thorndike wrote to me was, the whole Scuttlebutt program was thoughtful and balanced. I found it particularly interesting since, while I recognized most of the tunes discussed, I never identified with the lyrics and that part of the political and social movement. The songs and conversation elicited memories of my service time away from home and the background music of my era. Having never been in a combat zone, my personal perspective is limited to my patriotic duty to the military and being away from home and following the lead of my three older brothers. And I just might add to this, when Doug served, he was just recently married and then was deployed, and it really got to him. We were pretty close friends, and I remember how much he missed his wife. And when they visited me, 45 years later, I made a personal comment to her about that. Of course, she laughed it off, but I know she knew what I was saying. But Doug further wrote, having never been in near combat, my personal perspective is limited to my patriotic duty. The show was both insightful and informative. Comments and observations were cogent, and I feel better informed about that chapter in our history. Thanks to all involved. And he's very sincere about that. And I certainly appreciate it and wanted to share that comment with everybody in the audience today.
I can tell just by his vocabulary choices that he must be a well-read man.
Oh,
I would probably have to look up cogent just to be like, is this the right use of the word in this sentence?
Not only is he intelligent, their two daughters are both medical doctors, and wow. they certainly were well-read and a pleasure to be with during my time in the service.
That's so nice of him to send that response. Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, Doug, I really appreciate that. I think that everybody sort of reacted to this war music episode because I think music is so visceral. I think we mentioned that maybe in volume 1, and it brings back all of those memories and brings back all of those feelings. And, like you said in volume 1, Ryan, whenever you said we were all just hanging out and we heard this Green Day song, and it was just like, and then every time you hear it now, it sort of takes you back a bit. And I think that maybe force people in a way to get to their computer and be like, I want to chat with them about this. I want to have conversation. I think music is such a great conversation starter that I was just so happy to see the number of responses that we were receiving from this, and definitely our most responded to episode that we've done of the Scuttlebutt thus far. We are welcoming our historian, Kevin Koch. How's the baby, Kev?
Oh, he's good, man. He's actually, I'm at home alone. He's at daycare. I was doing some yard work and doing other things around the house, and I'm a little late to the conversation, but I'm glad to be back. And hello to Ryan and Donn again. So.
Where's my wet noodle?
Where's your wet noodle? That's for another podcast, my friend. That's not for this podcast.
So we were diving into some great responses here. Next up was Rich Doer. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into this. On May 17th, 2015, I was watching the final episode of Mad Men. The TV screen was filled with people on a mountainside singing, "I'd like to buy the world a Coke." In that moment, I was taken back to the Fubai Dial Telephone Exchange. I was the OIC, officer in charge of the Fubai SSD, Signals Support Detachment, a supporting unit for the 101st Airborne Division. By March of 1971, I was a 2-digit midget. Now, I'm going to pause right there real quick. Donn, what's a 2-digit midget?
2-digit midget means you have, let's say, 10 days to go in country, okay? And then once you go down to 9, the single digit, you'll be a single digit midget. So whenever you have the 2 digits in the number, you will be a 2-digit midget. Single digit, you're counting it down 9, 8, 7, 6. And then the comments of how short you are often funny. There's often a line to it, I'm so short I could jump off a dime and raise dust. And there's some more ribald comments to that as well, but I'll leave it to go at that. But being a four-timer is very important when you're looking forward to leaving the area that you're in. Many guys recognize that in several ways, and I remember one of ours was the bottles of Seagram's VO whiskey had a nice black and gold ribbon on it. Once you consumed that bottle as a short timer, you took that ribbon off and put it on your collar or on your cuff or something, and everybody recognized that coveted position of being a short timer.
Ryan, did they have that in the post 9/11 world as well? Not in the same way. No, there was no real excitement about it or any traditions. It was more like, please just stop sending me on patrol for like the last 2 weeks, please. Like, just let me hang out, put me on gate guard. I don't know, just try not to get blown up before we leave. That kind of stuff.
Right. Anyway, back to Rich. So less than 100 days to DEROS, DEROS. I'm not sure this acronym, but date estimated return from overseas. Less than 100. Okay. If I would have kept reading, I probably would have figured out what two-digit midget was. From 1100 to 1300, the crew split time between the mess hall and duty. At noon, the Armed Forces Radio Network started a show with the New Seekers, an Australian group singing "I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing." We had a radio tape player that I can only remember listening to at that hour. The song was very upbeat and positive. Since we did not have television, I didn't realize at the time that there was a commercial in the States for Koch that came before the lyrics were changed for the New Seekers. Near the end of the hour, mail was delivered. I received a cassette tape. My wife and I had exchanged tapes since the previous June. MARS, Military Auxiliary Radio System connections were not that frequent, and we wanted more than just written communication. This envelope would be unique. The tape contained a snippet of my 1-month-old son crying. Oh, God. When I returned to Vietnam after coming home from a stateside R&R to see him born, I got word of a 21-day drop in my DEROS date and would now be home in 2 months. Whenever I hear the ending of "I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing" and hear them echo through the hills for peace throughout the land, I'm back in Nam, remembering the sounds that were music to my ears. Wow. That gave me chills.
And it's just like we were just talking about. I mean, like, music connects you to a time and space in your life that is, significant. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. But I think that's why, music is so great.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember that song, Donn?
Vaguely, I do. I believe the commercial came out. I was probably deployed at that time, but I do vaguely remember that song, not identifying it with it that well. I think the commercial had a lot of children holding hands and global type of setting, but it wasn't something that I remembered that well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like different nationalities, it was men and women, black and white. I mean, because I only have a memory. I wasn't alive when the commercial came out, but I remember the end of Mad Men and that last shot when Don Draper has that one golden idea for that one brilliant ad, and he in the show they kind of make it seem like he's the one who thought of that commercial.
Spoiler alert.
So yeah.
No, I don't want to watch Mad Men.
That is.
Did you say spoiler alert? Oh yeah. Yeah, by the way, Mad Men's been off the air for a while, guys. So
Yeah, you had your chance.
After
someone's been around for like at least 2 years, you don't have to worry about spoiling it. They should have seen it.
Yeah. Next, Ryan, do you want to read George Dvorak?
Yes. So George sent us a response entitled that "You Touched a Nerve." So George had to say, "You really touched a nerve with this one. I'm one of those old Vietnam guys, May 1967 to May 1968. Yeah, the Tet time, the real one.
Ouch.
We flew to Arvin, Republic of Vietnam, out of Oakland Army Base, which was right across the bay from San Francisco. So that Scott McKenzie hippie anthem, 'If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair,' had special meaning for us. And the animals, 'We got to get out of this place,' is special too. It never mentions Vietnam, but we knew what they meant. You had to be in a club in Arvin when they played this song to appreciate it. The Flower Child generation was significant to us because we weren't part of it. In the clubs of VN, the VN teenager had bands. They'd sing American songs. I went up to one of the band members and tried to talk to him. We couldn't speak a word of English. The band had memorized the lyrics to the songs they performed. You could literally not tell that the band didn't know what they were singing. Don't forget the 1966 Royal Guardsman song about Snoopy and the Red Baron. A really big deal at White Sands Missile Range, where I was stationed just before going to Vietnam. You had to be in the officers club with 7 or 8 beers in you to appreciate the song. All you need to see is the Bob Hope Christmas show at Long Binh in 1967, and the same show in later years. The 1967 show was my army. Short haircuts and guys looking sharp. The later years show had a different army. The guys had peace signs on their helmets, long hair, including sideburns, and FTA, F the Army, on their helmets. And that was the officers. Things had changed along with the country. Oh yeah, our country. Memories.
Boy, there's a lot to dissect out of that response.
I think the Charlie Brown Christmas special came out in 64 or 65. So yeah. And so yeah, I mean, Snoopy, the whole cartoon, that Red Baron, I remember watching that as a kid on reruns, and my uncle telling me he watched it when he was like a teenager.
You know, especially mentioning the Bob Hope USO shows. Bob Hope is, remembered by many. He started in World War II doing these World War USO shows, giving up his Christmas to entertain the troops throughout the throughout the world. I attended the last one in '72, I believe it was, and it was Lola Falana and Roman Gabriel and all the names from the '70s. You know, there was I mean, there's 300,000 guys piled in, and I think Sean, I even sent to you the clip from the movie Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
When they bring the helicopter down with the Playboy girls, and all of a sudden the guys are starting to react unruly, and they left. It's quite a telling scene from that movie, but it was not quite that rambunctious, but it was still very, very. Number one, it was well received. Everybody wanted to have some of that entertainment from back in the country, and you felt appreciated somewhat by Bob Hope and the entertainers. They really gave their all in sometimes very difficult situations. They were under some rocket attacks back in '67, I believe it was, and Bob Hope was Bob Hope. And what always struck me whenever he brought all the pretty girls out, Miss USA, Miss World, somebody like that, he would always say, "Stand by, men." He goes, "This is what you're really fighting for." And then the girls would come out and the guys would all go ballistic, which was understandable at that time.
A lot different nowadays.
Very much.
That scene in Apocalypse Now, little dorky footnote, that's Bill Graham, the guy that plays the kind of the manager of that scene. That's Bill Graham, the promoter, who tosses the smoke marker at the end and does the peace sign and hops in. And he ran the Fillmore Winterland.
Fillmore.
He was there for I think he was there even for Live Aid and stuff. He was a world-renowned concert promoter, for those who don't know.
Donn, he says, George mentions in here the clubs in Vietnam. Did you ever visit any of those?
Oh, yes. All through Southeast Asia. And particularly when he mentioned the bands, I will certainly back that up. I was stationed in the Philippines after my tour of duty in Vietnam. And the Philippines was renowned for having their bands covering every type of music possible, from country western to soul. What really, the one that stands out in my mind is when they did Santana, You Got to Change Your Evil Ways. And again, they spoke, Philippines is an English-speaking country as well, but they really covered that well, to the point where in good humor, instead of saying, "You got to change your evil ways, baby," they would spin that and say, "You got to change your underwear, baby." Everybody would crack up, and it was just a fun time was had by all. But the clubs, be it the Enlisted Man Club, which always did a good job providing some entertainment. Most of it was from the Philippines or the Vietnamese bands. Mostly the Philippines. They really did a good job covering. They're talented musicians. They work hard, and it was something that they took with pride. So I certainly do remember the bands and the cover songs that they did. Everyone had one. When I was in the Philippines, every ship had their own bar. Okay, they would let's just say the Jolo Club would be dedicated to the USS Constellation. They would have a big sign, "Welcome sailors on the USS Constellation." That was like our home bar. Guys would just gravitate there, and that's where you were most welcome. Although you were welcomed everywhere back in the day. Of course, you had money to spend and time to enjoy yourself. So certainly those times were very well remembered by most sailors that were in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam era, because that entertainment became very profitable as well. Those bars and clubs throughout the country, even the Enlisted Man Club, really did well, and it was certainly a welcome time for us to get some American food and some cold beers, and you kind of felt safe there as well. But some of those places you had to watch your back, especially in country, because you never know the people that were serving you, what were they really asking you? What type of questions were they asking? And that goes back to that saying, "Loose lips sink ships." We had what was called the Bamboo Hotline. And if you wanted to know when the USS Ranger was coming in port, oftentimes you would go out in town and just ask some of the girls, what days are USS Ranger coming? She goes, "Oh, it's coming next week. You'll see them then." So it was certainly a welcome time for us, and a little bit way to blow off some steam.
Kevin, musically, it hadn't really even occurred to me that bands in Vietnam would be covering American songs. how far back does covering music go? This sounds like something that, for whatever reason, I thought was more, modern than even in the 60s. And how difficult do you think it was for them to cover American music? It's probably very different musically than what they were used to.
Lyrically, it might have been difficult. I can't imagine musically it was very difficult. You can pretty much drop a 4/4 beat behind a drum kit in any country and people are going to move. But covering popular, especially British and American top 40, be it British Invasion, be it soul and Motown, that was very, very popular in the mid 60s. I only know this because the band that I'm in is called Los Vampiros Amarillos. It means the Yellow Vampires. That band name came from a band that my father-in-law was in the mid 60s in Mexico City. He was a teenager growing up and playing the bands that were popular in Mexico and Central and South America at the time. They also covered American Top 40. They covered, the charts that were coming out of England and America. So they would play the bands that were local to the area, and then they would cover the Animals, they'd cover the Beatles, they'd cover the Rolling Stones, because those bands didn't tour Central and South America at the time. So the only way people local could hear those was if a local band learned all those songs and played them at the parties and at the dances. The same thing probably goes for Southeast Asia. These bands in the Philippines, these teenage kids that love American music. Well, those bands, the Beach Boys aren't going to play a bar in the Philippines for a bunch of guys that have just got off of tour, but these local kids could learn those songs and play them. Or if a guy wanted Johnny Cash, a kid could get up with a guitar and play those songs. So covering music like that was very, very common back then. You have to remember, rock and roll was only maybe 10 years old. So most of the stuff that was out was really good. And people would put out a record and a band that was popular would cover it like a month later. One of the first hits of the Byrds was a cover of Mr. Tambourine Man, which Bob Dylan had put out only a year before. That's not as common as today. It's very rare for a band to cover another artist that just came out. Normally they're covering an artist from 10 or 20 years earlier, but you have to remember, in the mid 60s, going into Vietnam, rock and roll arguably can be traced back to like the first recording, maybe was 1949. I think it was Fats Domino in New Orleans. But popular level, it really started up in 55 with Little Richard, Floyd Price, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley. So it was still pretty young. So you had a lot of bands out there, but there wasn't this big backlog of decades of rock and roll history. So covering music was really, really common back then, especially if you were an American living in another country. They would learn the pop hits or the jazz hits of the day and play them for people at popular resorts and stuff. It was a real big thing back then.
Yeah.
Donn, you look like you had a thought.
Yeah, I did. When Kevin was mentioning the early rock and roll, Ike Turner was one of the first to have one of the recognized rock and roll hits, Buick 59, and some other things by him. And of course, you had Big Joe Turner. You had a lot of rhythm and blues guys that transformed from rhythm and blues in the 40s, into rock and roll in the 50s. Little Richard and some of the others that were really well known back then. But so what happened, and I echo what Kevin says, those teenage bands would pick up on the British Invasion songs. The Beatles were real big back then, and they would just pick up on that. And the musical end of it was just first class. The lyrics and things, they spoke with an accent, or you can tell the dialect, etc. But their musical talent with that was just excellent. They worked hard at it. They worked very hard at it, and they wanted to please. They really did.
Yeah. The exciting thing back then about covering material too was if you were a pretty good musician with a bunch of guys behind you that could really, if I'm a drummer in a band with two guys who play guitar, bass, and keyboards, and three of us can sing, if you're a really good musician, even if you're just doing nothing but covers, you could be a really well-attended band, because bands didn't tour as much back then. If they toured, they didn't tour they don't do like these in the 70s and 80s where they started like going on tour for a year and playing, 30 cities in just America. And again, the backlog of rock and roll was so small that only the really good stuff got through. So you could be a band that played nothing but covers and have a solid 2-hour set list that would just light the place on fire, and people would come in droves to see you. So it was really exciting back then. It's much, much different now. Like, there's still kids in garages and basements slamming away, but to put it politely, they have decades of garbage they have to sort through before they can find good covers and before they can write their own material. Because like if you were writing original songs back then and you had nothing but Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley and like a bunch of really great jazz and bebop records to listen to, with all that mixed in plus your hard work, chances are you were going to write a pretty good original. Now it's a little different. So
Ryan, I think this is like leading to a much bigger conversation in the idea of just the USO shows that were have been around for a long time. And I'm interested in post 9/11, you know, vets, like what were the USO shows that you guys had? What bands were coming over and performing for you guys?
Yeah, the biggest one I didn't get to attend very many for various reasons, mostly because, you know, I was out busy doing a job. But the one I did get to go to, I remember actually being upset about because we had just come off of a week-long patrol set that had been particularly difficult, where we got very little sleep. And we had to wake up early to go see Toby Keith. And I was like, I could give a crap less about Toby Keith right now. I want to sleep. But my platoon sergeant like forced me to go. And I complained the whole time. But what was cool was I got to get up on stage and meet Toby Keith because my battle buddy had just recently returned from the hospital from being injured. And he got up there. So Toby brought him up on stage to recognize him in front of the crowd. And I got to go up there with him, which was kind of cool. I didn't get to, but I got to meet Toby Keith. My lasting impression of it was how big Toby Keith is. He is a large man. So
I thought you meant like fans wise, how big he is, not
no.
He's
how physically large Toby Keith was, because my friend Tom was in full kit, had his helmet on and his boots. And he's about my size, maybe even a little taller than me, so 5'9", 5'10". And Toby Keith put his hand like on Tom's head, you know, and it was like shoulder level. Like Toby Keith was literally another head and shoulders taller than my friend was, who was a little taller than me, and his hand was like on top of his helmet, like he was a little kid or something. I was like, wow. And then I looked Toby Keith up and realized he had played football and all this stuff. I'm like, well, I can see that because he is a huge human.
Yeah, he was an oil rig guy too, or something like that for a while. Yeah. I read somewhere, like he, you know, was out in the fields busting his ass for years before he even got into professional music.
Yeah. So that was my USO experience. The one other one that I was excited for was a bunch of Steelers and Bill Cowher were coming over, but it got canceled because of a sandstorm. So but you know, other than that, no good USO experiences for me.
Donn, there were USO shows back in Vietnam. Were there any that you attended?
Yes, it was the Bob Hope Show in 1972. He brought Lola Falana, Roman Gabriel, Les Brown and his band of renown, and a whole host of others. It was just entertainment. But again, he came on, and there's just so many people in the audience. And of course, it was being filmed for television too, so there was some staging involved, some theatrics, if you will. Mm-hmm. And they often ended with Bob Hope and his wife leading the audience into singing Silent Night. And that was a very, very Christmas time. You're away from home. Some guys away from home for the first time. And the whole tempo of that audience, from being very rambunctious and laughing and really having a good time with it, it became a somber time toward the end. Because again, that song Silent Night hit home with a lot of guys. And I kind of remember that. A lot of the USO shows are available on YouTube. They're worth seeing just to go back in the day, and how much Bob Hope and that group of entertainers had to go through to entertain the troops. They didn't go to the main bases at Da Nang or Cam Ranh Bay. They went out in the field sometimes, maybe not all of them, but they brought some with them. And I know that we had spoken earlier on about Korea and how that has been somewhat ignored. And we talked about Marilyn Monroe. And there's a very iconic picture of her coming off a plane. Korea in the middle of winter was very cold. She comes off, dumps off her fur coat, and she's got a strapless gown on, and she's Marilyn Monroe. And that was just something that the guys certainly appreciated. And as Bob Hope said, as he would introduce these very pretty women, he says, guys, this is what you're fighting for. And boom, here they come out. Something to be said for it.
I want to get back to our responses here. Donn, you had one from Len Conley.
I do. I'll be happy to read it. It's a little bit, I know Len very well. He was in country, I believe, in '66. Came out very quiet and wasn't the outgoing fellow that I once knew before he left. There was a reason for that. But Len wrote, I actually enjoyed the podcast. Not sure what I was expecting, but it was good. I never thought to think music as an aspect of the Vietnam era. You did a great job analyzing and giving your interpretation of this time. I tried to leave Vietnam behind me for years, as it was only a place I was and I wanted to withdraw from it. I grew bitter at the treatment of the veterans and still have much of that inside me, but this podcast shed light on aspects I never permitted myself to think of. So, given that podcast, Len went into a shell, many guys do, and when he was hearing some of the explanations we were giving about the music and how it impacted us, it took him out a little bit. And like I said, I know Len very well, and this was not a surprise response because a lot of times, particularly someone who's really has some bad memories and is trying to compartmentalize them and just close that door. This opened the door up for him a little bit, and I'm glad that we were able to do that for him.
It seems like music is the thing that will do that. I mean, we talk about smells sometimes with the Veterans Breakfast Club. What smell do you remember from your deployment? And there's always something that every veteran talks about, like that particular smell. Anytime you can't forget that smell of this thing. But it's that and music. It's very interesting. That's a really incredible response from Len. Thank you for that.
It was deep, and when you mentioned smells, I think the Vietnam era. Remember the fish sauce that was permeating in country almost as soon as you got off the plane with the heat, humidity. All of a sudden, you smell this smell, and you didn't know what it was until it was explained to you. Everything was made with that fish sauce, particularly in Korea. They had a fermented cabbage, I believe it was, called kimchi. It's a very culminating smell as well. And those do bring back some memories for you. You come back and say, man, that's that smoke smell, but that smell of cordite, that smell of sweat, just being out in the jungle for that period of time. And it's something that the senses will bring back memories to the brain.
Ryan, is there a scent or a sound, music that yeah?
All bad smells is what really sticks with me. What a porta john smells like at 130 degrees, when it's 130 degrees outside. Sand, that has a smell.
Sand has a smell?
And when it's in the air everywhere and permeating everything, yes, there's this moon dust stuff where it was like the smell of hot sand mixed with concrete that had been ground down to a dust from tanks driving on it. Things like that. Also, one thing that I think actually permanently ruined my sense of smell, because my wife always makes fun of me for not being able to smell things. There was a landfill about 15 miles north of Baghdad, right near the main highway that we would have to drive by, and they were always burning garbage, and it would waft across the highway, and so you'd be driving through it, and a lot of the times, you'd be up in a gunner's hatch or whatever, so you're exposed to the smell, and it doesn't matter, it's going through the Humvee, it's going through the armored vehicle, doesn't matter, and we had a name for that. It's a gross name, but there's not a swear word, but we called it cheesy beefy diarrhea. Was what it smelled like, and I think it did permanently mess up my smell. That and lemon lime Gatorade. That was like the one thing we had to drink that wasn't water. So now I can't drink lemon lime Gatorade. So when I drink lemon lime Gatorade, I think of being in Iraq because it was the one thing we had to drink that wasn't water.
Yeah. So taste can take you back as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry for that visual, but that's what it smelled like.
Oh, I can't forget that now. That's okay. Next response was from Ross Brewer. Ryan, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. Ross Brewer had to say, excellent show with a cast of characters with in-depth knowledge about the music that reflects the times during the Vietnam War up to the early 2000s. As it was mentioned during the show, sometimes you remember the words of a song or just the music, and it wasn't until now that I put the two together and related them to the war in Nam. Great song selection included in the related YouTube playlist. Well done and thanks.
A good cast of characters. That's a nice compliment.
I feel like it is. I feel like we really nailed it. I feel like we have a good dynamic going on here. We should carry this on.
Well, I figured this was kind of getting the band back together here. Maybe it was too early for the reunion tour, but didn't want to pass these responses up. Thank you, Ross, for sending that in. Really appreciate it. And I think last but certainly not least, Donn, we have Mark Prince.
Mark Prince and I served together during 2 tours of duty, and Mark is quite a character. He did a lot of photography of blues singers out on the West Coast after he got out of the Navy, and did some other things. He's an author. He's writing a book right now, and he's a pretty deep guy, and he has a wide variety of interests and a wide variety of music. And Mark wrote to me, appreciated the Scuttlebutt podcast about the music of wartime. World War II had the music of Glenn Miller and the Andrews Sisters. Our Vietnam had the Doers, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Country Joe and the Fish, and so much more. It brought a little bit of home into the jungles and onto the ships at sea. Good job, fellas.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that. And he brings up a great point. You know, we sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, this idea of World War II into Korean War and what music was being played during that time. Things shifted so drastically for music, I think, during the Vietnam War. But Kevin, maybe you could speak a little bit to that shift from World War II into Korean War and maybe what the troops were listening to at that time.
I think for a while, a lot of the kind of what was popular in America didn't change. In World War II, you certainly had jazz and big band, swing. That was those were the big things, and also Broadway musicals, which even into the early 60s were still having top 10 hits. So you had like Oklahoma coming out during the time of Oklahoma was in the mid 40s during the Second World War. For Korea, at least in America, I think the first rock and roll loosely was kind of bop and jazz. There was this not Dizzy Gillespie, excuse me. There was Charlie Parker. There was this shift in jazz music from the traditional dance band to smaller bands that was a bit more avant-garde, a bit more like what we would call coffee house nowadays. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was quite a bit of time between Korea and Vietnam, especially going from a police action to a escalation in the late 60s. And during that time, you had this massive shift in music where, you know, Elvis Presley and the Beatles were on television, and literally kids were in school the next day talking about how the whole world had changed because now they were introduced to this phenomenon that they had no idea about. You know, unfortunately, a lot of the Black artists who were really the creators and the inventors of rock and roll didn't get the same attention. So I still think Little Richard is the king of rock and roll. But yeah, that was something that certainly changed. You know, I've been doing a lot of thinking too since this last podcast about the music, the way it touched certain people, those kind of unsung heroes of music that inspired a lot of the musicians who we love and reference to in this podcast. Remember, a lot of those musicians back in the mid to late 60s, they had friends that were going over to Vietnam, and some of them weren't coming back. Being a big Springsteen fan and us talking about Born in the USA during the last show, I remembered that there was a drummer that Springsteen was in a band with by the name of Bart Haynes, who was the drummer of Springsteen's first proper band. And he showed up one day to band practice in his Marine fatigues, and he was going over to Vietnam. And he joked, like, I don't even know where it is, but I'm going. And he died in country during his tour. There's countless stories like that of people that inspired this change and this shift in music. A lot of it made the experience for a lot of these musicians personal. And I think that's something I think that music that they created really touches soldiers back then. You know, it wasn't just about singing about against the war. Like a lot of these people, emotionally speaking, had kind of skin in the game with family members and friends going over and not coming back. I think that's like probably the biggest change that had such a drastic effect on the music. I doubt a lot of soldiers in World War II knew Glenn Miller, and there wasn't a draft too, so it was different. And I don't think the Army and the armed forces had any problem seeking out soldiers to help fight fascism. But at some point, the Vietnam conflict went from being very popular to very unpopular in the States. And, that was a major shift in the policies and the politics of the war of the time. And that certainly affected the music. So that's a really big change. Yeah. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but I've been thinking a lot about those personal stories about these people who not only wrote these songs because they may have started to take two. I started thinking about these personal stories with these songwriters because not only did their opinion of the war shift, but they started to see friends of theirs not coming home, which made it a lot more personal, which may have caused them to write the material that they wrote and may have shifted their ideas about the idea of being over there fighting communism, as opposed to not getting any real answers as to why people were over there for so long. So, I mean, I'm sure that's something Donn could speak to more of. I mean, I just know what I've read through books and seen in documentaries and had the chance to talk to the occasional vet about that. So,
Kevin's point is very well made. And a lot of times when this started to happen probably in 68, 69. Okay, whenever the tide was turning, the 500,000 GIs in country in 68. And then afterwards, all of a sudden, people were leaving their homes. Or the draft was the big catalyst for that. Then the protests happened on the college campuses, and the world was starting to change. And the 68 Chicago riots was a big part of that as well. It was live on TV. All of a sudden, we're seeing these demonstrators being beaten by police, and the country started to be into turmoil. Assassinations happened, the country changed. And from a veteran standpoint, the music changed as well. And as we had mentioned before, it wasn't so much that we rejected that or found any offense with it, because that was just part of our era, part of our life as well. So the music certainly had a big impact on people, and it was somewhat interesting also because we were limited in some of the information that we were getting, some of the music that we were getting, until guys from recent draftees or whatever were coming in. And one of the first things you always ask someone who's a new guy, an FTN, if you will, where are you from in the world? Okay, it wasn't like where you just from. It was always the world. The big PX was the United States. Okay, you're going into Southeast Asia, and you were restricted with the information you were getting. You were restricted with the music that you were getting, and it was just something that we will remember that way.
Something that sort of makes me think of this shift in music. This brought up an idea of just the first time, Donn, that you heard this sound, this new sound that was sort of coming out. What did you think of it? I feel like nowadays it's very rare that I'll be driving in the car and a new song comes out and I'm like, oh, I've never heard that sound before. Or, wow, that sounds really incredible. Or it really captures you quite like I would think it did back in the 60s. Do you remember that?
I do. I remember it very well, especially in 1969. I was still home at the time. And when Woodstock came out, especially when the movie Woodstock came out, I think it came out in 70. But that whole scene of Woodstock was not my scene. I was a Motown guy. I was a jazz guy. I had different interest in music other than listening to Canned Heat or some of the psychedelic bands. That wasn't me, and I took that with me too. I didn't get into that type of music until well later. When Hendrix kind of came out, I grew into him. But I was all Motown, particularly the Temptations and the Supremes, and that sound. That's how we rolled back in the day. But when the psychedelic music came out, it took me a while to get myself into that. I did not like the Beatles when they came out in 63, 64. I think it was James Bond who said it pretty well in Goldfinger, 1963. And he says, you don't drink Dom Perignon when it's over 34 degrees, or you don't listen to the Beatles without earmuffs. That kind of stuck with me. But that said, that was just my own personal thing. And then, you're interacting with guys from different areas of the country and different interests, of course. And they brought their music with them, so we kind of shared it. I remember turning guys on to Miles Davis. Okay, that's where I was at 19 years old. And some of the guys said, "Who in the heck is that?" And I'm listening to Miles Davis, on a reel-to-reel tape, Kevin. Okay.
Yeah.
So it was just different times back then.
Donn, if you've not seen the documentary, The Summer of Soul, you absolutely have to see it. It's
on my bucket list. It is.
Yeah, it's just come out. For those who don't know, it was a concert held in Harlem in 1969. The footage, the director is Questlove, the musician, drummer of the Roots and of Late Night. The footage hasn't been seen for 50 years because it could just never be sold, because Woodstock was being pitched to the movie industry right at the same time as The Summer of Soul. But the lineup of that concert is just ridiculous. I mean, it's crazy. The band The Fifth Dimension is in this concert. They had the biggest hit in 1969, I think. Their hit of Let the Sun Shine with Age of Aquarius, which they got off of the movie, the Broadway show of Hair. They talk about how they did that too, but you absolutely have to see it.
Well, you had a lineup of B.B. King to Aretha Franklin to it was a who's who of black music.
It was the staple singers. It's insane.
That's definitely on my bucket list, Kevin. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I believe it's playing at the local theater up at the Manor up in Square Hall.
Yeah, and it's also streaming if that works for you too. I'd say go to the theater though, because it's really an emotional. It's quite an emotional journey. Right. Yeah.
Summer of Soul. Ryan, talk to me a bit about the music. We had talked about the music in post-neo. There wasn't really anything that was really coming out that was really capturing you guys. But was there something that you heard while over there that sort of like that was different than anything you had heard before? Somebody like Donn bringing, Motown in. Did somebody bring you music that you hadn't heard before?
Yeah, yes. Which was pretty cool. The different music tastes that you get anytime you get a group of different people together, they're going to have different interests, and it does kind of expose you to new things. And what I think is interesting is I was thinking about this when you said it's hard to hear music now today that you haven't heard some sort of thing before, right? But I think that the kind of the value in that is by hearing that sort or that type of music, it opens up a new generation to looking into older stuff. I remember when I heard the White Stripes for the first time, which happened, when I was overseas, and I was like, this is awesome. I was like, this is so cool. And then how that led you back to different types of music, which you would then be interested in. I think that's a very good value of having musicians inspired by other ones, which can then lead you to a better, more kind of fuller understanding and an appreciation for that style of music.
Mm-hmm. For this episode of the Scuttlebutt, we're going to hang a wrap on this one. We wanted to just dive into these responses, continue the conversation a bit, have some fun here, and look forward to season 4, which we might pull another volume 3. I think that if we can get some more responses about World War II era music, as well as Korean War era music, we'd love to hear about more of the bands that these veterans might have been listening to, maybe dive into a bit of that as well. But as always, make sure that you like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell, and leave us a comment or leave us a review. You can contact me at Sean@veteransbreakfastclub.org. That's SHAUN at veteransbreakfastclub.org. I want to thank you guys for jumping on with me for our reunion here. And I hope to see you guys again. We have some other things that are going to be cooking with Donn as well, so those will come out soon. Otherwise, have a great time, and we'll see you back here on the Scuttlebutt next week.